Hey friends, I've been making edibles for over 10 years now, and I still get questions I've never heard before. And that's what I love about this community and doing this show. You keep me on my toes, really. So here's what's happening. In a couple months, I'm doing a listener Q&A episode, and I want your questions. I haven't done a Q&A in about 3 years. The weird ones, the basic ones, the ones you've been too embarrassed to ask, the ones you've Googled 3 times and you still don't really have a clear answer. All of it is fair game. Maybe you've been trying to nail your dosing and it's just not clicking. Maybe you've got a batch that went sideways and you want to know why. Maybe you're just curious about something you've heard on the show and you want to go deeper. Maybe you're curious about Bite Me itself. Ask me. You can send a voice message if you want to hear your own voice on the show, or just drop your question in writing. Either way works. The link to submit is in the show notes, and I appreciate you for listening and for being a part of this community. And I really appreciate you trusting me with your questions. Stay curious and stay high, friends. Now let's get into today's episode. Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 361. Today, we are covering the topic of munchies and the science behind it. I'm your host, Margaret, a certified Gangier and TCI certified cannabis educator, and I believe your kitchen is the best dispensary that you'll ever have. Welcome to Bite Me, the show about edibles. Let's grab a snack, or not, maybe in this case, and let's dive in. Now, I just wanted to comment quickly before we get into today's episode that I have been putting out a call for questions as far as the listener Q&A episode that I'm planning coming up. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, I implore you to go ahead and shoot me an email, stayhigh@bitemepodcast.com, or you can reach out to me in the private community, send me a DM on Instagram, whatever works best for you. And if it doesn't get covered in this particular episode, I will be doing another one. I've done several listener Q&A episodes in the past. It's just been a long time since I did the last one. So I thought it was time to revisit that. So even though I'd like to try and keep the content inside these episodes a little more evergreen, just know that one way or another, we'll get your question answered. So today we're getting into something that almost everyone with a cannabis habit has experienced, but nobody actually really talks about a whole lot, and that's the munchies. And you know that feeling. You take a few hits or you eat a gummy, and 40 minutes later you're standing in front of the fridge at 11 p.m. eating cold rice straight out of the container with a fork and wondering how you got there. And for decades, this was kind of treated as a joke. It's stoner culture punchline. It's maybe a Cheech and Chong sight gag and something that you laugh about, but you don't really examine it. And for me, this came up recently because in the past, I have definitely suffered from the munchies. And if the munchies is not a side effect that you are wanting, then it can be pretty problematic. So I haven't really dealt with it in a while. I was talking to a friend of the family who came to the house to help me out with something around the house recently, and he generously offered his time and energy to do this repair that was required and wouldn't take any money for it. Like, we covered the repairs in his gas money. So I was like, "Do you smoke weed?" Because I'm growing some cannabis right now. And he's like, "No. I used to, but honestly, the munchies." And when you get to a certain age and you find that you have to be a little more careful with what you put in your mouth because once it's on the waistline, it's a lot harder to get rid of, then you probably know that feeling that he had to give up consuming cannabis because the munchies were too much and were affecting his health in other ways. And that's obviously, in most contexts, not what we want. Sometimes cannabis giving you the munchies is what you want, but a lot of the times it's not. This is what we're going to be talking about today. And here's what I'm hoping that you walk away with. That it's obviously not a character flaw or a lack of willpower. And it's not you being a stereotyped. It's a measurable neurological event happening in your hypothalamus, your olfactory bulb, and a set of neurons that scientists spent decades not really understanding. And there's actual peer-reviewed research here from Yale, from Washington State University, and a team out of Bordeaux, France. And it tells a pretty wild story about how THC hijacks the exact circuitry your brain uses to tell you when you're full and turns it into circuitry that tells you to eat. Because I know a chunk of you are here specifically because you don't want the munchies, because you're managing a health condition, watching your weight, or just tired of the 2 a.m. cereal bowl, I'm going to give you real practical ways to work with your own biology instead of fighting it blind. So let's get into it. And for me, it's not the 2 a.m. I'm the mid-afternoon snacker. That's when it really hits for me. For a long time, the leading theory on the munchies was pretty simple. Cannabis makes food taste and smell better, so you eat more. In fact, the friend that I was just referring to mentioned that exact same thing. Cannabis made food taste incredible, and then he couldn't stop. And so while this is true, it's incomplete, and it doesn't really explain why you'll eat when you're not even hungry, or why the effect is so specific to certain circuits in the brain, rather than just being a general everything is more fun now haze. The real breakthrough came out of Thomas Horvath's lab at Yale School of Medicine, published in the Journal of Nature in 2015 with Marco Koch as the lead author. And this is one of those studies where scientists themselves say they were surprised by what they found. There's a population of cells in your hypothalamus, specifically in a region called the acute nucleus, called POMC neurons. So POMC stands for, and I'm going to butcher this, pro-opiomelanocortin, which is a mouthful. I probably did not say that correctly. So just think of these as your brain stop eating your full cells. And for decades, if you shut these neurons down in a mouse, that mouse became obese. And that's how essentially they are trying to tell your body when to quit eating. They are definitely the satiety switch. The Yale team set out to trace the brain circuitry behind cannabis-driven eating by manipulating the specific pathway that mediates cannabis's action in the brain. And what they found flips the whole story. Cannabinoid receptor activation doesn't shut these satiety neurons down. It turns them on, but in a way that produces the opposite of their normal job. The exact cells built to tell you to stop eating get hijacked into telling you to keep eating instead. And that's the part that we're going to focus on. Your brain isn't going quiet on the fullness signal. It's your brain's fullness signal getting rerouted and used against you. Activating the CB1 receptor in that arcuate nucleus region turns these POMC neurons on and increases food consumption, even in animals that had already eaten and should have felt satisfied. Even in a fed, satisfied state, cannabis can override that I'm good signal. And there's a second layer to this that I find really interesting from a home cook and biology nerd perspective, and that's the mechanism isn't just electrical, it's chemical. Researchers found that activating this receptor selectively boosts release of beta endorphin, one compound these neurons produce without boosting the companion hormone that normally suppresses appetite. And blocking the opioid pathway with a drug called naloxone shuts the whole cannabis-driven feeding response down. So in plain terms, THC is splitting one neuron's output into two different signals and picking the one that makes you hungry while suppressing the one that would normally make you stop. So if you've ever felt like the munchies come on almost involuntarily, like there's a hijacking happening rather than a simple craving, you are more right than you knew. And there's a mechanical override happening in real time in a part of your brain literally built to prevent overeating. Okay, so that explains the I feel compelled to eat piece, but it doesn't fully explain the other half of the munchies experience. Why a slightly stale cracker suddenly tastes like the best thing you've ever put in your mouth. I feel like this happens too when you're camping. For that, we go to a 2014 study out of Nature Neuroscience led by Edgar Soria Gomez and Giovanni Marciano, working out of the Neurocenter Mengendi in Bordeaux. This team looked at the olfactory bulb, part of your brain that processes smell, which turns out to be much more tightly linked to appetite than most people realize. They found that this same cannabinoid receptor system promotes eating in hungry, fasted animals specifically by increasing odor detection. In other words, cannabis isn't just making you feel hungrier in the same abstract sense. It's meaningfully sharpening the animal's sense of smell for food and driving them to eat more of it. A real chunk of why you eat more after using cannabis is that you can actually detect and register food more acutely than you could sober. Here's the detail I find most interesting. This effect isn't just cannabis turns up all your senses generally. The researchers also bred animals that lacked the specific cannabinoid receptor in their olfactory bulbs. And when these animals were given THC, nothing happened. No sharper smell, and critically, no increase in appetite either. That's an elegant piece of science. Remove the receptor and you remove both the enhanced smell and the munchies in the same animals at the same time. That tells you that the smell enhancement isn't a side effect that happens to ride along with the munchies, is part of the actual mechanism causing them. And this system fires up because the animal is hungry in the first place. It's designed to make fasted, hungry bodies more sensitive to food cues in the environment so they go find food effectively. Cannabis appears to tap into a system that already exists for exactly this purpose and crank the dial well past where it would normally sit. That's why the munchies hit differently depending on your state going in. If you're already full from dinner, the effect has less room to work with. If you're running on an empty stomach when you consume, you're handing this system the exact conditions it's built to exploit. And here's something I love about actually reading the research instead of just repeating the folklore. The science is still being actively written. This isn't a closed case from a decade ago. A newer study out of the Washington State University published in Scientific Reports at the end of 2023, led by researcher John Davis, adds another piece of this puzzle. That team looked at a different population of hypothalamic cells called AGRP neurons, also known as appetite stimulating cells, to find out whether these were involved in cannabis-driven eating too, separate from the POMC story out of Yale. Working with vaporized cannabis, which mirrors how people actually consume far better than an injected compound would, they found that chemically silencing these AGRP neurons blunted the appetite-stimulating effect of cannabis exposure. This tells us that these neurons are functionally involved in regulating cannabis-induced feeding behavior in their own right. So we're not looking at one single Munchies neuron. We're looking at multiple overlapping systems in the hypothalamus that cannabis engages at the same time. The POMC pathway, the AGRP pathway, the olfactory pathway, several redundant systems all nudging you towards the fridge at once. Using calcium imaging, a technique similar to a brain MRI, the same team observed cannabis activating a distinct set of hypothalamic cells specifically when the animal anticipated and then consumed a favorite food, cells that stayed quiet entirely in animals that hadn't been exposed to cannabis. The word anticipated matters. Part of this isn't only about the eating itself, it's about the anticipation of a good meal lighting up in a way it simply doesn't when you're sober. I want to flag something here as your host and not a scientist because I think it matters for how we talk about this stuff. Almost everything I just walked you through is animal research, mostly in mice. And that doesn't make it irrelevant to us. This receptor and hypothalamic wiring exists in human brains too. And the Washington State team specifically chose vaporized cannabis because it mirrors human use patterns closely. But we should hold this as, here's the mechanism as best understood so far, not here is exactly and completely what's happening in your specific brain tonight. Good science reporting means being honest about that gap, and I'd rather be straight with you overall than oversell the certainty that we don't actually have. They use mice for a reason, but also we're not mice. So now is the part that a lot of you probably came here for. It's that if you don't want the munchie or you're managing them for a health reason, here's what the mechanism itself tells us about how to intervene. So eat before you consume, not after. Since this entire system is amplified by a fasted state, going into your session already fed, it takes away a good chunk of its leverage. Have a real meal first. Don't consume on an empty stomach if the munchies are something you're actively trying to avoid. Consider your cannabinoid ratio, not just your dose. THCV, which is tetrahydrocannabivarin, if I have said that correctly, is a minor cannabinoid associated with appetite suppression rather than stimulation, working in essentially the opposite direction of THC on these same systems. If you can find products or flower with meaningful THCV content, it's a real lever, not folklore. CBD is also worth looking at too, since it modulates this receptor system rather than activating it the way THC does. And some people find that a higher CBD to THC ratio noticeably blunts the hunger surge. And THCV is often found in cultivars like Durban Poison. Dose lower than you think you need, but the receptor activation driving all of this is dose dependent. A moderate, well-calibrated dose gets you the effects you're actually looking for without needing to go so high that you're maximally lighting up every one of these appetite pathways at once. If you've been overshooting your dose, the Munchies might be less about cannabis and food in general and more about a dosing habit that might be worth a revisit. Have something ready before you're compelled to want it. Since a big part of this is anticipation and heightened smell pulling you towards palatable food specifically, decide what yes looks like before you're in the moment. And also, many of us are dealing with what is known as hyper-palatable foods. And I think you probably know what I'm talking about, even if you haven't heard this term before. But hyper-palatable foods are ones that are full of sugar and salt and fat. Think potato chips or ice cream that are marketed to us and kind of designed for overeating. So decide what yes looks like before you're in the moment. Cut up some fruit, a pre-portioned bowl of nuts, something that satisfies the mechanism without derailing your week. Actually, those stuffed dates work really well for me, I will say, that I did recently. I have been enjoying those. I'm probably going to make some more. I'm planning on buying some more dates. I love dates generally, but as someone with a sweet tooth, that really hits for me. The goal isn't willpower, since we just spent 50 minutes establishing that willpower isn't really the mechanism at play here, and the goal is removing the decision point. Now, I realize sometimes in the moment you might just throw that out the window anyway, but at least give yourself a fighting chance. Cut up the fruit, stuff the dates, make something that's going to satisfy you and pre-portion it before you get into this panic state, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Hydrate before you assume you're hungry. Not a neuroscience point, just an old practical one. That cannabis can produce dry mouth, and general dehydration cues can get misread as hunger. So have water going on and track your own patterns. Everybody's receptor sensitivity, tolerance, and personal triggers are a little different. Write down what you consumed, how much, on what kind of stomach, and what happened next. And you'll start seeing your own personal Munchies fingerprint within a couple of weeks. And that's more useful to you long-term than any general rule I can give you on a podcast. And if this is a conversation you want to keep having in more depth, particularly if you're managing this alongside a health condition or wellness goal, that's exactly the territory we go deeper on inside the Bite Me Cannabis Club. You're probably not the only person in that community quietly trying to solve this exact problem. And here's what I want to leave you with. The Munchies, they can be kind of funny, not really a joke, and they're not about weak willpower. They're a real 3-part neurological event, your fullness neurons getting flipped into hunger hormones, your sense of smell getting tuned up specifically for food, and a whole additional layer of hypothalamic cells lighting up in anticipation before you even take a bite. That's not a character flaw, that's biological wiring. And once you understand the wiring, you can make actual choices instead of just reacting to it at 11 p.m. with a fork in that cold container of leftovers. That's the whole philosophy behind this show. Your kitchen is the best dispensary that you'll ever have, and that includes understanding your own biology well enough to work with it instead of being ambushed by it. Take control of your high life, Munchies included. And with that, my friends, I would love to hear, how do you manage the Munchies? Do you even still get the Munchies? Have you found something like THCV to be helpful? Let me know. I would love to hear it. With that, my friends, I am your host, Margaret. And until next time, stay curious and stay high.